Pain is like an earthen pot, in the hands of a great porter. Clay returns to clay. Arise in the land of the living. Yakubibanabantu production.
Yakubibanabantu, Mutoto wa Kibantu, Bana Bermuntu. Bana Bermuntu.
The 20th century is rife with genocide. The Herero and Nama people of Namibia were the victims of the first genocide during this dark century. Between 1904 and 1908, thousands of people were subject to starvation, medical experiments, and murder. Anywhere between 75 and 100,000 people died as a result of the policies of the German colonial authorities in what was then German Southwest Africa. In today's video, we will look into the uprising of the Herero and Nama people, the response of the German authorities, and the consequences for those involved. The colony of German Southwest Africa was first established in 1884 as a trading outpost, though soon developed into a settler colony for those 3,000 Germans. The colonial authorities encouraged its settlers to seize land from the native Africans for the betterment of the German Empire. The Germans were also able to achieve this by exploiting tribal conflicts and rivalries, by offering protection in exchange for land. The African subjects were treated as lower-class citizens, who after having their land taken were to end up on reservations. The goal was to create a colony occupied by white Germans with the Africans contained and used for labour. The two major ethnic groups who resisted such attempts to obtain land were the Herero and Nama peoples. The Herero people were largely herdsmen and warriors. The way of life often resulted in conflicts with the German settlers, from disputes for access to water and grazing lands to conflicts arising following assaults on Herero women and girls. And these assaults were often unpunished by the German colonial authorities. Through unethical loan agreements, the German settlers were able to obtain Herero cattle and lands. In addition, plans to expand the railway lines through Herero territory further exacerbated tensions. As more land was obtained by the Germans, it became clear that the future for many would be life contained to a reservation, stripped of their wealth and way of life. In 1904, the Herero people rose up against the German colonial authorities. This was led by Samuel Herero, the paramount chief, who had previously signed a protection agreement with the German forces. Whilst the Germans were distracted by a minor uprising in the south, the Herero launched their assault. Attacks on the settlers resulted in around 150 German casualties, with orders not to harm missionaries, women and children. Despite calls for bloody revenge, Governor Theodor Lutvine attempted to avoid further bloodshed and escalation of violence, well aware that he was outnumbered. Whilst the governor negotiated for a ceasefire, many Herero were emboldened and continued to fight. In response, Germany arranged for 7,000 soldiers to be dispatched to quash the rebellion, and Lutvine was relieved of his position. Despite some success in unifying other tribes to the cause of expelling the German settlers, the Herero forces, their families and livestock were routed to the Waterberg Plateau in August of 1904. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, the German forces and their superior technology defeated the Herero, pushing them into the Omake Desert. Though it was a victory for the German forces, it was not decisive enough, as they failed to capture Maherero, and many of the Herero were not willing to surrender. Trotha decreed that any captured Herero males were to be killed, whilst the women and children were to be pushed into and kept in the desert. Waterholes were poisoned as the German forces pursued and hemmed in the Herero people. On the 2nd of October 1904, Trotha issued an order to completely destroy the remnants of the Herero. It stated, "The Herero are no longer German subjects. Any Herero sighted within the German borders with or without a weapon, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children, but will send them back to their people or let them be slaughtered." Upon realizing the treatment of the Herero people, the Nama people, under the leadership of Hendrik Witbooi, rose up against the German forces. The Nama and Herero were often at conflict with one another, yet for some time before, Witbooi had warned against the very treaty Herero had signed with the Germans, warning it could be a burden that would weigh on him as heavy as the sun. Witbooi was well regarded by the likes of Governor Lutvine, who is quoted as saying, "Witbooi would have been an immortal world leader had he not been born to an insignificant African throne." Witbooi had for some time sided with the Germans against the Herero, but had turned against them upon seeing the harsher treatment of their traditional enemies. On the 3rd of October 1904, the Nama launched their attacks based upon the Boer War guerrilla tactics, and like the Herero, they avoided harming women, children and missionaries. But the Nama were joining the conflict well after the Herero had been defeated. Their campaign against the Germans was doomed, as it came too late and was not unified. Witbooi died in combat in 1905, though the Nama people did not surrender until 1908. During the conflict, the German employed the use of concentration camps to house the Herero and Nama fighters, along with their families. Following the lead of the British forces in the Boer War, the German word Konzentrationslager was a direct translation of the English term concentration camp. The most infamous of these camps was located on Shark Island, which was just off the coast of Luderitz. Established in March of 1905, the death rates were exceedingly high, with around 200 people dying within the first 2 months alone. Amongst them were 80 children. The coastal conditions were near inhospitable, especially for people accustomed to living on the open bush with their cattle. The cold, windy climate was made worse with a lack of meaningful shelter and lack of food. All the captives had access for food was uncooked rice and flour, with the occasional horse meat that had perished at the camp. Shark Island was pretty much a death sentence for those that were sent there, with an estimated 80% mortality rate. It is argued by some that the general staff in Berlin saw an opportunity in the rebellion to use the rebels as slave labour to build up the infrastructure, notably in the coastal region of Lutvine. Prisoners were used as forced labourers, often to build the very railroads that had been a factor in starting the rebellion. Those used as forced labourers were often worked to death under the ever-watchful eye of their captors. One witness to the treatment level against the Herero captives stated the following: "On one occasion, I saw a woman carrying a child of under a year old slung at her back, and, with a heavy sack of grain on her head, she fell. The corporal whipped her for certainly more than 4 minutes, and whipped the baby as well. The woman struggled slowly to her feet and went on with her load. She did not utter a sound the whole time, but the baby cried very hard." Of the prisoners held at Shark Island, between 3,000 and 4,000 would die there. As reports of the level of cruelty at Shark Island spread, some Herero even ended their own lives rather than end up at that particular camp. You would either die there from being worked to death, die from malnutrition, or die from typhoid. Perhaps most shocking of all was the use of Herero prisoners as medical experiments, usually to prove the racial superiority of the Germans compared to the Africans. Thousands of women were assaulted by German soldiers, often resulting in pregnancies. One notable individual who carried out experiments on the children born from these assaults was Dr. Eugene Fischer. His conclusion was that these mixed ethnicity children were inferior to the German fathers. Fischer's research warning against the mixing of Africans and Germans would lead the German colonial authorities to ban such unions in its colonies in 1912. Fischer's research also had him presiding over the harvesting of skulls for those who died at Shark Island. These skulls were prepared by the other inmates by boiling the heads of the dead and removing the flesh with broken glass. Around 300 of these skulls were harvested and sent to Germany for further research. The research would be used in an attempt to prove German superiority. It's important to note that Fischer's beliefs heavily inspired the Nazi Party, with Hitler reading his works while imprisoned and writing his book Mein Kampf. Fischer would go on to espouse and teach his theories to Nazi doctors, with the likes of Dr. Ottmar von Voiture, who would in turn go on to teach Josef Mengele. Fischer would also carry out the sort of experiments that would be found in the Nazi death camps some 40 years later. He would inject smallpox and tuberculosis into his subjects, followed by all manner of experimental treatments. The efficacy of such treatments would be studied post-mortem. Forced sterilizations were carried out on the unwilling prisoners in a bid to reduce the population and learn the most effective way to carry out this barbaric procedure. It is clear that the German forces were well aware of the consequences of their actions, and it's clear that these were the desired outcomes. The goal was either to destroy the Herero and Nama people or enslave them to commit genocide. Anywhere from 75,000 to 100,000 people died, which equated to 80% of the Herero people and 50% of the Nama people. Of those who died, it is estimated that half died in the concentration camps or as forced laborers. Official records of the conflict noted the following. This bold enterprise shows up the most brilliant light of the ruthless energy of the German command in pursuing their beaten enemy. No pains, no sacrifices were spared in eliminating the last remnants of enemy resistance. Like a wounded beast, the enemy was tracked down from one waterhole to the next, until finally, he became the very victim of his own environment. The arid desert was to complete what the German army had begun, the extermination of the Herero nation. The policies of Lieutenant General Trotha can only be seen to completely destroy the Herero people, in methods that can only be called genocidal. In dealing with the Nama people, he also issued a warning to those that had not surrendered, asking them what fate has befallen the Herero, implying the same would befall them. The links between the German actions in Namibia and the Nazi regime are clear to see. It was Heinrich Ernst Göring who signed the protection treaties with the Namibian tribes that fomented division. Heinrich Göring was the father of the Nazi second-in-command, Hermann Göring. It was a lieutenant named Franz Ritter von Epp who served under Trotha and engaged in the genocide, who provided funds for the Nazi Party and obtained the surplus brown-shirted uniforms for the Nazi SA to wear, uniforms that were meant for the German African colonies. Von Epp would go on to be a leader in Bavaria, responsible for the liquidation of Jews and Roma in the region. It was the likes of Dr. Fischer who, using the skulls of Herero prisoners, would push for the notion of Aryan supremacy central to Nazi ideology. It is often too easy to see each historical event in a vacuum, but it's important to understand the consequences of one event and how it flows and influences another. It was not until 1985 that the persecution of the Herero and Nama people was classed as a genocide following a United Nations report. Whilst Germany has not yet issued a formal apology, regret has been expressed, along with increased financial support to the region. Skulls and remains from those prisoners from Shark Island were repatriated and returned to Namibia in 2018. Many of the skulls were removed from German universities where they had been kept for over a century. In May of 2021, a formal statement from Germany agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros over the next 30 years as a gesture of reconciliation, and agreed to recognize the crimes as genocide. Though they stopped short of calling the payment reparations, the funds are earmarked for projects relating to land reform, rural infrastructure, water supply, and professional training. The genocide of the Herero and Nama people was but the first of a long list of genocides committed in the 20th century. Many genocides follow a certain pattern. An inferior people are to be removed or destroyed by self-described superior people. The colonial attitudes against Africans and dismay at the violent rebellion of the Herero and Nama against German expansion was met with the attempted wholesale destruction of two peoples. I would invite you all to look into the events of the Herero and Nama genocide and remember the victims of the first genocide of the 20th century.